Rolling.
Caleb, it's a pleasure to speak with you. And for a change, we're not hooking up on the road somewhere. This is kind of nice. um, this book is very interesting in these particular times. I was actually, before I saw what you had written, thinking of the same concept almost upside down. With the Trump age and all of that, you have the parties that constitute the official left, um, looking at Trump as the the personification of Hitler, Mussolini, fascism, the hard right, etc. In other words, it's the collapse of the capitalist system finally that we saw presaged in the 30s, and the real Hitler has arisen, maybe the Antichrist, whatever imagery they use to portray it. And therefore, ideology is everything. And the ideology that we need right now is anti-fascism, even if that includes fighting a global war. And actually, kind of, especially if that includes fighting a global war, because the rallying point for much of the anti-Trump constituency is that Russia has become a fascist country that wants to expand, as has China. They are not socialist. They are not communist. They are not democratic or progressive. And consequently, they must be squashed or fascism will rule the world. And so we got to go to war with them. That's kind of the unity point among them from, I say Answer, whoever, the groups on the left and the anti-Trump Republicans and the Democratic Party, I guess. This book turns that whole thing inside out, and I'm interested in having you explain what made you see the need for this and what you see and what you describe in the book, to the extent you could teach people with it.
Yeah, well, I think the reason we see that as the line of the Uniparty is, for one reason, that they all seem to be able to trace their roots back to people who thought that very thing. I mean, you just described that worldview. That's very much the worldview of Max Shachtman and Irving Howe and Irving Kristol and the folks who broke with Trotsky in 1939. And ended up working for the CIA in the 1950s and built, and kind of crafted the new left, and then ended up voting for Richard Nixon, a lot of them, at least by 1972. And it's a particular perspective that views the United States as on a mission to spread freedom around the world and overthrow governments that get in their way. And that it's okay to lie to the mass public because average people are just too stupid to understand it all. And the average people, when it really gets down to it, we're all really, really dangerous. It's a worldview that equates the Soviet Union with Nazi Germany and views them both as examples of excessive democracy, right? If the people just get too involved, they create an authoritarian state. And that's why America needs to protect the intellectuals. And that's why we need to manipulate the masses to get them to support our wars. It's a particularly elitist worldview. And it is descended from the New York intellectuals, which were the Trotskyists of New York City, the wing of the Socialist Workers' Party in 1939 that had a big fight with Trotsky and ultimately went their own way just as World War II was breaking out. And there's been a lot of talk about this since the Bush years. People have been speculating and saying, why is it that so many of these people that seem like warmongers in the Republican Party, advocates of regime change, why is it that if you look at their history, they trace back to Trotskyism? What's going on there? And there's never been a book that just tells that whole story. There's been books that reflect on it, like books that I quote, like The New York Intellectuals by Alan M. Wald, Who Paid the Piper? The Cultural Cold War by Francis Stone Sonder, The Struggle for a Proletarian Party by James Cannon. And I put all of that together. I weave it all together into one story that shows that, Trotsky himself, from Trotsky himself, all the way up to John Bolton today, there is an intellectual continuity. And I'm really happy to be able to just concisely tell that story. And I will say the book is selling amazingly. It is the #1 top seller on Amazon in the category of radical thought. And the amount of interview requests I'm getting right now is massive. I've been on with Kim Iverson, and I've got podcasts lined up like you wouldn't believe, because people just want to hear this story. And the American people are rejecting what the neocons have offered. They don't want these endless regime change wars. They don't buy the idea that we're, as a country, it's our obligation to just go around overthrowing governments and waging wars. And they especially don't like the idea that certain people think it's okay to lie and manipulate us to go along with it. So in a moment where there is kind of a populist upsurge and anger at the establishment in the United States, I think this book is a very important contribution. And that's why there's so much interest in it.
It comes at an interesting time internationally as well. I mean, at this moment, as a matter of fact, with the things going on around Venezuela, where you have had for a while in Latin America a variety of so-called communist parties who were attacking the socialist governments in Bolivia and Venezuela and Nicaragua as not being, true to the tradition, that ideologically they're compromised, and that really pay no attention to the material reality, which is supposed to be the basis of Marxism. And so, at this moment when you've got battleships off the coast of Venezuela and so-called communists calling for the overthrow of the Maduro socialist government, maybe you could translate this book into Spanish and drop a few copies of it out of an airplane into Caracas or something. I don't know.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's interesting because it seemed like for a while the mainstream left liked Hugo Chavez when he was getting up at the UN and calling Bush the devil, etc. But after the death of Hugo Chavez, Barack Obama arranged the oil price drop with Saudi Arabia, and Nicolas Maduro came into power, and Obama dropped the oil prices, which really hurt Venezuela, and escalated the sanctions. And then they had the La Salida campaign, which was a social media propaganda effort to remove Maduro. And ever since then, all the big name leftists, Noam Chomsky and Amy Goodman and Jacobin Magazine, and all of them just, scrambled away from supporting Venezuela. At this point, Venezuela's supporters are China, Russia, and Iran. In particular, Iran has been very close to Venezuela, and they are part of the anti-imperialist camp. And, it reveals there are obvious differences. I've been to Caracas. I've seen what, Venezuela and the socialist revolution there has done. I walked through a neighborhood in central Caracas where every house had been paid for by an interest-free loan provided by the Bolivarian government. I've talked to people who, grew up and, got access to literacy and just, got electrification because of the Venezuelan government. And, there are a lot of impoverished working class people in Venezuela who really have benefited from the fact that they have a government that fought against the big monopolies, took control of the oil, and used the oil resources to provide for the people. And they stood by that government. And if Venezuela was going to fall, if there's going to be an internal coup or something like that, it would have happened already. Things were very bad in 2015 when I was there, and they've improved since then. And Iran and Venezuela have gotten closer, and now they're producing their own food, which they didn't do before. That was why they had the difficulty, is they imported their food, and so the USA put sanctions on them, and then the oil price dropped, and then they had the food crisis. They're not in a food crisis anymore. The military is trained in Cuba and is ready to fight, and they've got Bolivarian militias on call, millions of Venezuelans that have guns in their household, and they're ready to fight. And if the USA were to attack Venezuela, I can assure you there'd be a number of American soldiers coming home in body bags, and I don't want that. That would be criminal. No American should die to overthrow a government that the Venezuelan people love. It would be absolutely criminal for any American soldier to set foot on the soil of Venezuela, put the Venezuelans in a situation where they have to defend themselves and deflect a foreign invader. So I really hope this is just some geopolitical maneuvering. This is possibly related to Marco Rubio and the talks between the United States and Russia that are taking place to set the stage for ending the war, and that there's some complicated games going on. We know that right now the Russian leader is in China, and Russia and China are standing beside Venezuela, and there's, about to be a big celebration to commemorate the victory over fascism in the Second World War, the victory over Japan in particular in Beijing. So I assume this is just a bunch of political maneuvering, and I hope that that these ships are moved out of there pretty soon, and that this is de-escalated, because the Venezuelan people will fight. And I have talked to people in Central Caracas who are ready to give their lives for this revolution. And they have endured so much, and they've beaten back so many attempts. They've got a military that's trained in Cuba and is ready for this. And I mean, Venezuela will become a graveyard of American soldiers. So we need to just stay out of there.
Yeah, agreed. And the model in Venezuela. I haven't been to Venezuela, but I've spoken with plenty of people who observed this thing that seems like from the outside that the Bolivarian circles, the organized, people on the ground, very much like the CDRs in Cuba, that where, people basically, you're going to come in here and try to take over our country, we're going to kill you.
Yes.
So self-defense. The phenomenon was observable back easily the first time that the U.S. decided to send military against Afghanistan back in 2001. The first time it was, overt. And you had people on the left, people who are official anti-war voices, as a matter of fact, in the United States, that were saying that this would be a good thing because the mullahs and the religious clerics, that whole thing is very regressive and anti-female and etc., and that the women of Afghanistan would actually be liberated from this by American troops invading. Like an absolutely no material sense of I'm involved in a war against imperialism, and so that means that you look at a military strategy and a diplomatic strategy, a whole war making apparatus, and this is the enemy. You do not go to war against anyone else at the enemy's side. The enemy, you need to gather everyone else against the enemy rather than what's been done. And I see the same phenomenon here, and the need for your book to critique that, because this is maybe gearing up for the final battle or something approaching that.
Well, there's so much talk among Republicans now. I mean, the reason this book is catching on is because there is people like Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens and Nick Fuentes that are starting to talk about the neocons and saying they don't like the neocons. And there's an upsurge of interest in who are the neoconservatives in the Republican Party. Where did they come from? Now, generally, you get two narratives about who they are. The first is kind of a libertarian narrative. We heard this from Alex Jones going back to the Bush years. And they said, well, these neoconservatives, a lot of them are Trotskyists, and Trotskyism is communism, and communists hate freedom. So they hate freedom, and they want to set up a communist dictatorship, and so they, just like they're taking away our freedom and etc. That's a narrative you get. Now you get a much more crude narrative, kind of a blatantly anti-Semitic narrative that, well, communism is a Jewish conspiracy, and these people are all a bunch of Jews, and so this is all just a Jewish conspiracy or something like that. Both of those narratives are completely wrong and very, very, shallow. There is a continuity between Trotsky all the way up to John Bolton. And you can look at it. It's not a conspiracy, though. It's a mindset. It's a belief system. And it's really contempt for the people. It's anti-populism. The idea that populism is bad. The idea that the people need to be kind of ruled over. And that if the people get together, they're very, very dangerous. That's the continuity. Leon Trotsky was, he was born in Kherson, which is, a contested territory now in the battlefield, and in the war that's going on over there. He was born there. He joined first the Narodniks, which were the peasant, revolutionary movement. He eventually joined the Marxist movement, and he was, close to Lenin and all those folks. And in 1912, when the Bolsheviks were going to set up their own party, Trotsky did not agree with doing that. Rather than joining the Bolsheviks, he decided to form his own group called the August Bloc. And he formed that bloc, and there were a number of other forces that rejected Lenin's call for a new party. And among them was the Jewish Bund. And the Jewish Bund was this group in Russia that said, Jews are just so special, we have to have our own party. We can't, join the regular, communist groups. Lenin kind of castigated the Jewish Bund, and he said that mindset was what he called the spirit of the ghetto. This idea that Jews are to be separate, that they're just so persecuted, they're just so different, they have to be separate and have their own group. He said that's the spirit of the ghetto, and that the road to liberating Jewish people from anti-Semitism is assimilation. And merging them with the rest of the working class. And that, the most blatant expression of what Lenin called the spirit of the ghetto was Zionism. But he said that the Jewish Bund, this group that kind of aligned with Trotsky against the Bolsheviks, that they were another expression of that spirit of the ghetto. Trotsky is in exile most of his life prior to 1917. He lived in New York City for a while. And funny anecdote, he had a reputation. Multiple places, the New York Times and others have talked about his reputation for refusing to tip in restaurants. He wouldn't tip. And when the waiter would bring the check, he would give the waiter a speech about how you should form a union. You shouldn't have to wait on guys like me to tip for you and all of that. And, according to the New York Times, they spilled soup on him at one point, or he was like threatened not to come back to restaurants because he was so rude in his refusal to tip waiters. Regardless, 1917 comes along, and he heads over to Russia, and he joins the Bolsheviks in July of 1917. He merges his group into the Bolsheviks. After the revolution, he's sent to sign the treaty with the Germans, right? The Bolsheviks have taken power on a platform of we're going to end involvement in World War I. They send him to negotiate the treaty to end involvement in the war with the Germans, and he doesn't sign it. He comes back with no treaty. And he says he has this great idea that they'll have no war but no peace, meaning that they'll never sign a treaty with the Germans, but they'll demobilize the fighting. Well, that's obviously not a realistic idea. And ultimately, Trotsky steps down as foreign minister, and they do sign the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, but Russia loses a huge amount of territory. The Soviet Union has to cede a bunch of territory because Trotsky stalled the signing of the treaty. So after Lenin dies, there's kind of a debate about what the Soviet Union should do. And Stalin puts forward the notion of socialism in one country, that they should, industrialize with 5-year economic plans. Trotsky's theory is permanent revolution. He wants to spread communism all over the world. And his main thesis is that the peasant class is too reactionary. The peasants are inherently reactionary. And because Russia has a peasant majority, they can't have a full socialist country. So they just need to be kind of a base area to march, communism into Western Europe. Well, the Russian population is very weary of war. Millions have died in the Russian Civil War and in World War I, and they don't want to, have a military society that marches communism into Western Europe. And so he's rejected on that front. Trotsky vehemently disagrees with the United Front and aligning the communists with the KMT in China, right? He doesn't agree with that alliance. He thinks that they should be opposing the KMT. So over those disagreements, he ultimately flees the Soviet Union. He moves to Turkey, eventually to France, and then to Mexico, where he, ultimately died. In the final, part of his life in the late 1930s, Trotsky was basically functioning as a professional anti-communist. He was going around saying, look, I was a founder of the Russian Revolution. I was part of the Red Army, and the Soviet Union is no good. They've sold out. And in doing so, he's being boosted by fascists, whether he knows it or not. I mean, we don't know that he knew this, but he's being boosted by fascists. At the time, the Nazis are playing up Ukrainian nationalism. The idea that Ukraine is oppressed by the Soviet Union needs to break away. Trotsky jumps on the bandwagon, and he calls for the independence of Ukraine, an independent Ukrainian Soviet Republic, break Ukraine away from the Soviet Union. In Spain, communists are organizing around the world, bringing volunteers to Spain to defend the Spanish Republic against Franco. Trotsky and his followers, they form the POUM, and they launch an uprising against the Spanish Republic. And that's where the term fifth column comes from. Franco said, we had 4 columns outside Barcelona, but he has a 5th column inside. And he's referring to the Trotskyists that are, this kind of trying to maneuver and, weaken the Spanish Republic from within. An interesting episode is in 1940, before Trotsky is killed, there's been a congressional committee in the U.S. Congress to investigate Roosevelt for his ties to the Communist Party. Martin dies as a member of Congress who doesn't like Roosevelt, and he's formed what eventually becomes the House Un-American Activities Committee. Back then, they call it the Dies Committee. and they reach out to Trotsky to
Right.
testify about about the role of Stalin, and to condemn the Communist Party, to condemn Roosevelt for working with the Communist Party. Trotsky agrees. He's willing to testify. They're going to fly him to the United States to give a speech against Roosevelt and against the Communist Party before Congress, and he's prepared to do it. He's very happy to do it. But then, obviously, Trotsky's a Marxist, and these are Republicans, so they rescinded the invitation. Shortly after that, he was killed. The reason that he was killed was because his movement was neutral in the Second World War. And when France was invaded, he condemned the French Communist Party for trying to, wage a kind of a patriotic resistance to the Nazis. His followers were trying to organize a union within the U.S. armed forces to disrupt the war effort. And the Soviet government basically saw him as somebody who would maneuver within global communism and within the labor movement to weaken the fight against fascism. So he had to be killed. He was found guilty in absentia in the Soviet Union for conspiring to overthrow Stalin in coordination with the Nazis. I'm not here to argue that he actually did that. Grover Furr has done a lot of scholarship and shows that there is evidence to back up that claim. I'm not here to say that he necessarily is guilty of that, but it appears that fascist forces were using him. William Randolph Hearst was the pro-fascist, anti-communist newspaper tycoon. He was publishing Trotsky's writings, and circulating them in the United States. Mussolini apparently was using Trotsky's book, The Revolution Betrayed, and circulating it in Italy. And there's an odd parallel between Trotsky and a Nazi named Gregor Strasser. You ever heard of Gregor Strasser? Yeah, Gregor Strasser was a founder of the Nazi Party who didn't like Hitler. He had a falling out with Hitler. He said, Hitler's sold out. I'm the true Nazi. Hitler killed him on the night of the long knives. So his brother, Otto Strasser, fled to Britain. And the British had a radio broadcast into Nazi Germany during World War II from Otto Strasser, saying that, that Hitler was a sellout and that the true Nazism was Strasser and Otto Strasser's theories. It looks like, to some degree or other, Trotsky and Otto Strasser were a similar thing. This is intelligence. This is geopolitical maneuvering. That that during the Second World War, Joseph Goebbels wrote about how they had a Trotskyist radio broadcast into the Soviet Union. And they were broadcasting Trotskyist messages to try and undermine Stalin, just like the British were broadcasting Otto Strasser into Nazi Germany. And that's kind of the role that Trotsky played. But the neocons come out of the divide that he had with his followers just as World War II was breaking out. That's where you can find the origin of the neoconservatives.
We're vulnerable to this exact kind of mischief just because of the nature of all of it. You have either, I don't know, science or religion, or, what is and what appears, whatever. Ideologies that are, derived from studying reality and measuring it and testing it, as opposed to, whatever, religious, made up, magical thinking, whatever. When you're talking about the structure of society and international relations and even municipal and state governments in the United States, these things are so complex and the people are so alienated from their operation. Most people have no idea that there's a problem just with the structure of electing a president or a member of Congress on 2 or 3 or 5 issues where you have either, black or white, when they're going to go in and deal with the administration and legislation to operate a government. It's so far removed from self-government that they have no real concept of what it is. And so all you get is a virtual association with these things, which means that the best sounding ideology is going to be persuasive for a lot of people, as opposed to ideological consistency that comes with the fact that all of my decision making and perspective are derived in experience and physical contact. I don't know how to put this into. It's like the difference between kids that were raised, say, in the 1940s and 50s before television and all this other crap, and kids now who are raised with cell phones. your experience growing up then was all in the real world, the material world. It was all physical. If you say this to the wrong person, they punch you in the face, or you fall down and get cold in the winter, whatever. It was all real. Now it's almost all virtual. And so the relationship to reality is different. Well, look at people that are trying to deal with political economy from the ground up. That's the problem that we have too. And so when someone like Trotsky comes along and has a sweeter sounding explanation for how things are and should be than somebody who says, yeah, they suck and we've got a lot of work to do, and that's just the way it is, it's attractive to a lot of people. And so it becomes difficult to organize, and it's something that can be targeted at people that are actually working to deal with issues like international relations and imperialism and et cetera. I don't know.
Yeah, well, I guess the issue that kind of gave birth to the neocons was that, in New York City, the Communist Party was very powerful. They controlled 2 city council seats. They had a guy in the House of Representatives, Vito Marcantonio. And in the late 1930s, the Communist Party kind of downplayed its radicalism. They had what was called the Popular Front, where they were supporting Roosevelt, emphasizing that, racism is un-American. It's like the fascists, calling themselves the inheritors of America's democratic traditions and such. And that, to be a communist in New York City, especially among kind of intellectuals and others, was pretty normal. But to be a Trotskyist, it seemed more radical. They were talking about dictatorship of the proletariat and workers' revolution, and they seemed to be a bit more radical. And there's a magazine, very interesting magazine called Partisan Review. And it was originally a Communist Party, literary magazine. And it went out of business. And then it was resurrected, in 1937 by the head of the philosophy department at NYU, a guy named James Burnham, along with another guy who was a longtime kind of social democrat, critic of the Communist Party, a guy named Sidney Hook. And this magazine, Partisan Review, was kind of the radical magazine, and it was resurrected as an anti-communist or anti-Stalinist leftist publication. And it was, at all the major universities, you had Partisan Review was being circulated, and it was this Trotskyist magazine. And you had this group of people that joined the Trotskyists in New York City because it was a way to appear more edgy and radical. To be a communist was already pretty popular, but to be a Trotskyist was to be more edgy and radical. And that, the Trotskyists, at that point, they're part of the Socialist Party, like a faction in the Socialist Party. But in 1939, they formed their own party, the Socialist Workers' Party. And it's really 2 parties in one. On the one hand, you have the Teamsters Union, right? James Cannon and Farrell Dobbs and a lot of these Trotskyists, they've joined the Teamsters. Why? Because the Teamsters are a Republican-aligned union, right? The Communist Party is supporting Roosevelt and the Democrats, and so the Teamsters are Republicans. So they joined the Teamsters Union, and they have a history going back to the Minneapolis strike of 1934, and they're working against the Communist Party and the labor movement. So they're with the Teamsters, and Farrell Dobbs and James Cannon, they have a lot of support, and they're key in building the Teamsters Union in the Midwest, in Iowa, and in Nebraska and places like that. The Teamsters have great, expansions. And actually, Jimmy Hoffa was trained by Trotskyists. He was trained by Farrell Dobbs and James Cannon and others. So Jimmy Hoffa, comes out of that, and they're in the Teamsters Union. That's one wing of the SWP. But the other wing is what they start referring to as the New York intellectuals, which are these college professors and writers in New York City. And it's like 2 parties in one. And what really is the big moment is that in 1939, the Soviet Union signed the non-aggression pact with Hitler, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, because the Soviet Union had reached out to every country in the West to try and form an anti-Nazi alliance. Yeah, no one else would do it. So to buy time, basically, because they knew the Nazis were going to invade them, they signed the pact in 1939. And at that moment, suddenly, the U.S. media was in an anti-communist overdrive. And, Roosevelt threw the head of the Communist Party, Earl Browder, in federal prison for a passport violation. Time magazine started calling the communists the communazis. And suddenly, the communists are viewed as hypocrites, et cetera. And in that moment, the New York intellectuals, they want nothing to do with the Soviet Union. It's completely no good. It's aligned with the Nazis, which it wasn't ever aligned with them, but that's the way it's being presented in U.S. media. They want to completely denounce the Soviet Union, whereas Trotsky maintains that, the Soviet Union is still what he calls a degenerated workers' state. And so they have a fight over the nature of the Soviet Union. And James Burnham and Max Shachtman and Martin Aburn and a number of these folks, the folks who control the Young People's Socialist League of New York City, they call them the YPSLs, the Young People's Socialist League. They have a big fight with Trotsky over, is the Soviet Union still a deformed workers' state or not? But it's not really about that. That's just kind of on the surface. The fight is that they don't want to be part of an organization. They want intellectual freedom. They want to think for themselves, and they attack the Socialist Workers Party for following cult of the leader. And they say that we don't want to take orders from Moscow or from Mexico City. We want to think for ourselves, and that's what they always say. We think for ourselves. That's why we follow mainstream media. That's why we follow U.S. imperialism. And we hear that right up to today. So many people say, "Well, I won't watch RT. I think for myself." Well, they just, in thinking for themselves, they happen to follow mainstream media. This is a long standard thing, but they, in the name of their intellectual freedom and other things, they have this big fight. And they determine that the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany are the same economic system. It's bureaucrat collectivism, neither capitalism or socialism. It's bureaucrat collectivism, and it's got to be opposed. And some think it's state capitalism, the Soviet Communist Party or the new bourgeoisie. Some say it's this other system called bureaucrat collectivism. Some don't even care about the Soviet Union. They're just mad about the Cannon regime, and they want to think for themselves, and etc. And it's an ugly fight. And ultimately, the New York intellectuals cut their ties with Trotsky in 1939. Right as World War II is breaking out, they have this fight. And if you read The Struggle for a Proletarian Party by James Cannon, he points out that it was pressure. It was the pressure of going at odds with U.S. imperialism. For the first time, they were in a position where, because the USA and the Soviet Union were their kind of alliance, or their anti-fascist unity was broken, because the media was in an anti-communist overdrive. That was the pressure that they caved in under. They just couldn't bring themselves to go against U.S. imperialism. And in the name of their freedom of thought and whatever, they broke with Trotskyism completely. Now, the leader of them is a guy named Max Shachtman. And Max Shachtman is somebody that, if it's this game, you could do 6 degrees of separation. Everybody in post-war American politics, Republicans and Democrats, you can trace them back to him. Max Shachtman was the leader of the Workers' Party that eventually became the Independent Socialist League. He eventually, merged into the Socialist Party. But he was the personal advisor to George Meany, the head of the AFL-CIO in the 1960s. If you look at it, Irving Howe and Michael Harrington, who founded DSA, they were students of Max Shachtman. In fact, Michael Harrington's big book, Socialism, is dedicated to Max Shachtman. Carl Girshman, who headed the National Endowment for Democracy, was the head of it, starting under Reagan, had been a follower of Max Shachtman. Jeane Kirkpatrick, the United Nations ambassador under Ronald Reagan, she had been a member of the Young People's Socialist League in New York City and a follower of Max Shachtman. Bayard Rustin, who was Martin Luther King Jr.'s top advisor, he had been a follower of Max Shachtman. Irving Kristol, who's considered the intellectual godfather of neoconservatism, he had been a follower of Max Shachtman. And you go down the line, it's all these people, Susan Sontag, Mary McCarthy, Hannah Arendt, all of them had worked with Max Shachtman and been part of the Independent Socialist League, had written for Partisan Review magazine. They come out of this same circle of people. And it's weird because they create the new left, and then they redefine conservatism. Starting in after World War II, right, McCarthyism sets in. The Communist Party is public enemy number one. They're widely hated. And that's when the CIA starts recruiting these people. They kind of, their first operation is to go against the Waldorf Peace Conference. In 1949, the Soviet Union puts on a peace conference at the Waldorf Hotel, where Shostakovich comes in from the Soviet Union, W.E.B. Du Bois speaks, Albert Einstein speaks, Aaron Copland, all kinds of writers and intellectuals and scientists, Oppenheimer, others get up and oppose the Cold War. It's a peace conference. And the New York intellectuals, they oppose it, and it's an intelligence operation. They don't just protest against it. They intercept its mail. They infiltrate it. They try to get its bank accounts shut down. They run an operation against the Waldorf Peace Conference that is carried out. And out of that, they set up what's called the Committee for Cultural Freedom, which eventually becomes the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which the CIA brags on its website as being one of its most successful operations, the Congress for Cultural Freedom. And it looks like it's just a group of professors and academics who are against both U.S. imperialism and the Soviet Union. But in reality, it's a CIA program. It's all being paid for by American intelligence. And Irving Kristol, he's the guy who directs it. He's a follower of Max Shachtman, and he's a guy who becomes the director of the Congress for Cultural Freedom program. And Partisan Review magazine gets pushed out. It's on all the college campuses. It's this kind of edgy, radical magazine that is critical of McCarthyism and supporting the civil rights movement, etc. But it also wages this kind of cancel culture hate campaign against people who support the Communist Party, including Albert Einstein. They go after Albert Einstein for being a collaborator with the Stalinist regime. They go after Lillian Hellman, the playwright. And it's this magazine that's everywhere that is looking kind of radical and edgy and against the system, but it's also saying stay away from anyone who's pro-Soviet and kind of waging a personal hate campaign against them. And that's Partisan Review. And all these former Trotskyists, all these Shachtmanites, followers of Max Shachtman, are working for Partisan Review magazine. And in the process, they start kind of changing what it means to be a leftist. They're not really talking about the working class fighting the capitalists. They're talking about intellectual freedom and nonconformity. And they kind of, a big point that they're constantly doing is equating Nazi Germany with the Soviet Union, and defining them both as kind of populist systems where the freedom of intellectuals is taken away. Ultimately, Susan Sontag proclaims that communism is just the most successful form of fascism, and that becomes her position. Hannah Arendt is very popular in these circles. She's written a book about totalitarianism. And when Adolf Eichmann is arrested by Israel, the Nazi war criminal, she goes and covers his trial, and she writes a book called Eichmann in Jerusalem, a study on the banality of evil. And the book basically says that Eichmann's a normal guy, and he worked for the YMCA before he became a Nazi. And Eichmann is just what ordinary people are deep down. Ordinary people that aren't, great intellectuals like Hannah Arendt. They are Nazis deep down. That Nazism is just rooted in how average people are deep down. We're authoritarians, we're oppressive, and Nazism isn't the breakdown of capitalism. Nazism isn't imperialism in crisis. It's just this evil within the human spirit, right? They're anti-human. They view human beings as the problem. This is kind of laying the basis for it. Irving Kristol, who at that point is still like a leftist, kind of, is running the program. Now, later, though, the New Left, which these guys kind of support, right? I mean, they kind of craft the New Left Review, Partisan Review, and the New Left turns into the Black Liberation Movement, and the Black Panthers, that are a Marxist-Leninist group, are growing in popularity. And on the college campuses, the anti-Vietnam War movement becomes very pro-communist and is waving the flag of the Vietnamese, and et cetera. And 1968, 1969, some of these folks say that the radical movement is just too dangerous and become supporters of Richard Nixon. And Irving Howe, he's, the Marxist who, comes out of this milieu. And he writes for the New York Times. He writes attacks on the New Left and the student movement for the New York Times from a Marxist perspective. He notices, that God forbid some of these new leftists are also opposing Israel, and he's a big Israel supporter. And so he says they're anti-Semitic. He writes articles about that for the New York Times Review of Books and New York Times Magazine. And they start to feel like maybe Richard Nixon is better because he'll take out the New Left because they're so dangerous and they're so pro-communist. 1972, Max Shachtman, he's the advisor to George Meany of the AFL-CIO, and he supports Henry Jackson and Hubert Humphrey, more moderate Democrats, pro-war Democrats. But when Eugene McCarthy wins the nomination of the Democratic Party in 1972, Max Shachtman endorses Richard Nixon because he says that, that Eugene McCarthy is just too soft on communism. What's interesting is Zbigniew Brzezinski, who's generally associated with the Democrats, he took the same position that you had to support Nixon in 72 because, Eugene McCarthy, who said he was going to end the Vietnam War immediately, was just too soft on the Soviets, too soft on communism. That is kind of the beginning. What you might call the Socialist Party of America breaks into three pieces in 1972. The pacifist wing of it becomes Socialist Party USA. And that's David McReynolds, who ran for president many times, the War Resisters League. They're pacifists. They're completely against the Vietnam War. DSA is Michael Harrington and Irving Howe and a number of followers of Max Shachtman who are kind of against the Vietnam War. They say that it needs to de-escalate, but they had supported the Vietnam War initially. And then there's another group of people that had went with Shachtman that had endorsed Nixon in 1972. They're called Social Democrats USA, and that's the breakup of the Socialist Party. That's it's interesting because that's where DSA comes out of, and that's also where the neocons come out of. Jeane Kirkpatrick and Carl Girshman and others. They're the ones that are pro-Nixon, whereas DSA are the ones that are supporting the Democratic Party. And what's interesting is one of the people that helped found DSA is Gloria Steinem, who is the voice of American feminism. She admits, she brags about how the CIA made her. Her whole career goes back to the CIA as early as 1962. They were sending her to international communist festivals to set off smoke bombs and make problems. She's an intelligence asset from the beginning. She's a founder of DSA, and DSA is basically set up as the Socialist Party breaks apart. It is kind of a pro-intelligence, pro-CIA, socialist outlet that emerges amid the confusion and the political crisis of the early 1970s.
So, it makes sense from their point of view that in a world where you actually have the class relations that exist, the dynamics of their, structure, as described even 150 years ago or more, whatever, that the natural response of the people to learn the nature of the system that they're in, and understand or remember collectively that this is not our fate or our only possible fate, and to organize themselves into doing something about it. That as you see this developing, let's say from Marx forward and other trends as well, that the fight back has to be to blunt organizing around fundamental principles like the working class taking power. And so the parties that would purport to do that have to be the main target. And so their legitimacy is got to be job one with people that don't have a God's eye view of events, that are on the ground trying to figure out from the factory floor or from some row of corn in a field in Indiana or whatever, what the hell is going on in the larger world. And so you have this, we know what the Nazis are. Everybody did their homework for us already. The public knows what that is. These guys were Nazis too. The guy there telling you, throw off your chains and follow him, he's a Nazi too. This is, to be expected almost, right? And it's so effective though, and it's been going on for a really long time. And this traces some of the mechanical processes and the steps taken in the history of it. And I think that it's very important for people to become familiar with or refamiliarize themselves with this. I don't think very many people are as familiar with it as you are, frankly. You're very well studied in this stuff for a long time.
Well, it's important, and I end the book. I have an appendix in the book because during the 2024 election, there was a professor and a member of DSA, and out of the blue, he publishes a book, a hit piece on a Trotskyist leader in Britain who's been dead for 35 years, Jerry Healy, and he publishes this smear book on Jerry Healy. And if you read the acknowledgments, it's paid for by Israel. It's paid for by the Center for Jewish Studies, which is a Zionist outfit in Britain. Yeah. And he acknowledges that they saw the global implications of his book. And if you read the book, DSA publishes this book that's a hit piece on a Trotskyist activist who's one of the most pro-Palestine activists in the 1970s and 80s, Jerry Healy. In 1978 at the Oscars, Vanessa Redgrave won the Oscar for Best Supporting Actress. And in her speech, she said, I want to thank the Academy for not listening to the Zionist thugs and hoodlums. It was a big moment, right? Well, Vanessa Redgrave was a member of the Workers' Revolutionary Party, which was a Trotskyist group that supported Gaddafi and was very close to Gaddafi and was supporting the Palestinians. And that organization was destroyed by mainstream media in Britain based on all kinds of sex gossip and all kinds of distortions. And I mean, it was destroyed in 1985. And Ken Livingston maintains to this day that that was an intelligence operation. And, that they were very, very close to Gaddafi, and they were very anti-Zionist when that issue was much more taboo. And so, he's been dead for how long? But in the middle of the 2024 election, DSA rolls out a book that they're circulating everywhere with Jacobin about, oh, watch out for Jerry Healy. Jerry Healy is the archetype. If you read the book, they're saying that Jerry Healy's Hitler, basically. Jerry Healy's anti-Semitic. They're saying that, he's a populist. He's using authoritarian methods and running his organization. And it's kind of weird, but, I include that appendix in the book because it shows you how important this stuff is, right? The neocons know where they came from, right? John Bolton was never a Trotskyist, but he was trained by these people. Sovietology was a field of study. They called it Sovietology in the 1980s.
I remember.
Yeah, and it's where all these, John Bolton comes out of that. Elliot Abrams comes out of that. And it was Trotskyists who developed the kind of the theory and the understanding that was for the field of Sovietology. And the war hawks, who are now, trying to drive U.S. foreign policy, they come out of that sphere. Now, Anne Marie Slaughter is Hillary Clinton's advisor, right? Anne Marie Slaughter worked very closely with the Hillary Clinton State Department. And she's also a neoconservative. And if you read what she wrote and how she sees the world as a fight between the open international system of free markets and free information versus populist regimes, she's a neocon, and she sees it as, we're on a mission to spread global revolution against tyranny. That's how they see it. And that neoconservatism is basically, there's a group of leftists who realize that to advance their careers, they should be on the other side. They should serve imperialism, but they use leftist aesthetics and leftist feelings to sell the wars. That rather than selling the wars on the basis of, just expansionism or, in the name of Christianity or whatever, sell the wars in a leftist way. You're fighting to free the women. You're fighting to free the LGBT people. You're fighting to tear down an authoritarian regime, appealing to the Oedipal drive, right? I mean, that's Sigmund Freud talks about, every teenager wants to kill their parents at some point, right? Appealing to the Oedipal drive in all of us and our desire for vengeance and rage and destruction, right? The thrill of rebellion, the lure of the protester in the street, right? That was a big part of the Arab Spring, right? We want to see the people out there fighting, if they can appeal to our Oedipal and libidinal drive, and manipulate that to serve imperialism. They're taking the leftist aesthetic and they're weaponizing it for imperialism. That's the essence of what the neocons are. And it's very sinister. And that, Leo Strauss was never a Trotskyist. Leo Strauss was a philosophy professor, but Irving Kristol and Leo Strauss and Susan Sontag and all of them got very close. And Leo Strauss, he wrote his book, Philosophy and the Art of Writing, where he argues that all the great philosophers of history have had to write in code. Because if the average people knew what they really believed, they would not support them. And that the philosopher kings, the superior intellectuals, they need to rule over the rest of us. And that Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union are the same. And they're examples of the kind of authoritarian regimes that average people set up when they get out of control. And his favorite TV show is Gunsmoke. And in Gunsmoke, the good guy wears a white hat and he's all good. The bad guy wears a black hat. He's all bad. And he says that's how average Americans should understand politics. And he writes about the noble lie. It's okay to lie to people about weapons of mass destruction. It's okay to lie about Russiagate. It's okay to lie to people because average people, they just can't understand it. And it needs to be Gunsmoke for them. Average people need to see, the world as Gunsmoke, as, good versus evil or whatever. We, the smart people, we can handle the intricacies and the complexities for them. And that's the neocon worldview. And it's interesting that the neocons were crafting U.S. foreign policy and strategizing, and that Leo Strauss was telling them, his favorite, TV show was Gunsmoke, and that's how Americans should see it. we've had two presidents that are literally cowboys, right? That take on the cowboy persona. Ronald Reagan was literally a cowboy actor from Hollywood. And Bush, even though he was born in Connecticut, he put on the cowboy hat and he was out there with his dog Barney and he took on the cowboy persona. The neocons had a lot to do. You know, these are backroom people. These are not people that average people were reading their works and all of that. These are the people in the back room advising the strategy of how to sell war and propaganda. And often these backroom people are more important. We get to vote for the actual politicians. But, you know, we never got to vote for Samantha Power. You know, we never got to vote for Irving Kristol. You know, we never get to vote for these kind of Ben Rhodes, who served in the Obama administration. And these people, if you look into who they are and how they see the world, that's where you'll start to understand the very vulgar realities of the elitism, right? I mean, that Barack Obama didn't even want to go into Libya. But they worked on him for 3 days and they tapped into his, you know, psychological problems, his damage, you know, being the child of a single mother, you know, seeing, you know, his mother beaten by his stepfather in Indonesia. And they knew how to push Obama's buttons and get him to intervene in Libya. And he said that bombing Libya was his greatest regret as president, going in there without a clear plan. And he said his greatest moment was when he managed to not bomb Syria in 2013, you know, when Syria gave up their chemical weapons and he didn't end up having to bomb them. So Obama says the best moment of his presidency is when he didn't do what Hillary Clinton wanted. And the worst moment of his presidency was when he did. You know, these folks, the regime change activists, if you want to call them that, that's what the neocons are. And they're in the Republican and Democratic Party. And that they have taken the aesthetics of leftism as a way to sell and promote their cause. And I think that's something we all need to understand, and it'll make things a lot clearer. So I'm glad I was able to write this book and tell this story.
And I'm glad you wrote it, and I'm glad the story's out there, and hopefully some folks it'll open the eyes of some folks, and it'll help them understand the world a little better.
Indeed.
So thanks for your time, Caleb. I look forward to speaking with you again and seeing you around, and be well until then.
Sure thing. Yeah, always a pleasure.
Thanks.